Hey everybody, Brian here. In today's video, I'm going to show you something super exciting. We're going to learn how to take a Logic drummer part for acoustic kits and totally transform them into electronic kits. So if you want a wild ride into a new way to go about drum production, then let's go and make things less boring.
I had it all. I had a wardrobe that was getting very respectable. I was close.
Okay, here I am in Logic, and what I have on this first track here was just a drummer track. I think drummer is one of the coolest parts about Logic. Pretty awesome, you can really quickly lay down drum tracks. So let's say you're working on an electronic piece.
So what you're telling me is to be bored, and then bored, and finally bored again, but this time for the rest of my life.
And you don't have anything, no bass line, no melody. Your first step might be to just get drummer loaded up and start experimenting. So maybe first, it's on the big room, EDM setting, and you check it out. So that's pretty typical 4 on the floor. Now maybe you want to check out, say, something else like dubstep to get that halftime kind of feel. Now you might have a bass line. So I've actually written out a bass line I'm currently working on. So now you can do things like tell drummer to follow the bass. So I'm choosing that heavy bass track. And it's starting to sound pretty cool, but I'm still not feeling any originality, nothing fresh in that drum part.
Well, I already heard that one, you fucking unoriginal bastard!
Now it is grooving really nicely with the bass, and if you turn off this follow heavy bass, it's subtle, but that groove is kind of lost a bit. So we'll get that back in there. Again, it's subtle, but that's an improvement. But let's say you're going after something a little different, and not just your very typical run-of-the-mill electronic drums production kind of workflow. So now what we're going to do is something completely different, and this might seem like we're going into a pretty deep rabbit hole.
Okay, Sarah, you have to calm down. And the only way you're going to do that is to breathe, yeah? Okay, breathe.
But just follow me. I think in the end, you're going to find this kind of interesting, kind of fun, maybe a little crazy. And, you know, musicians, artists should thrive in craziness. So now I'm going to forget about this electronic part. And you know, with most electronic drum parts, you don't get a lot of variation in the hi-hats. I don't know why it is, but people seem to think hi-hats should be pretty static in electronic parts. So that's why we're moving on to Logic acoustic kits with their ability to do very realistic hi-hats, because they're opening and closing the way a real drummer would actually do that. And getting hi-hats to have that kind of good opening and closing kind of vibe is pretty tough to program, especially if you're not a drummer. And now what I have here is a drummer part that's playing psychedelic. Well, it's labeled psychedelic, but it's actually playing funk style drums. And now with this particular piece, I decided I want the hi-hats starting out, and later on I want it to go to the ride. So I'm changing these patterns a bit, changing the complexity and intensity levels, the fill amounts. Some places I'm specifying it to play a snare center versus letting it just do it automatically, etc. So just the kind of stuff you typically want to do in drummer to really fine-tune the drum production and make it fit your vision. So I've done that, and now I can play that back. So I'm kind of liking the sound of that, but my goal was to get this to be kind of an electronic, vibey kind of piece. So what can we do? Well, with my Logic drums to anything script, I can actually transform this acoustic drum part into any given electronic kit. So what I have on this track is Battery. So I'm going to open up Battery, and I've chosen this hardcore Gothik kit. I was going for kind of an aggressive sound with this piece, and what I did is I made some edits. So if you open up Hardcore Gothik, just the regular one, you're not going to see any of these lines down here. I've added those. So some of this is percussion, as well as I've doubled up the cymbal 1, 2, and 3 down here. I'm doing here is I'm adding some choke capability in case I want to add that later into the MIDI. So cymbal 1 in the cymbal 1 group, cymbal 2, cymbal 2 group, cymbal 3 group. And then for these choke articulations, all I did was modify the volume envelope. So with cymbal 1, I modified the volume envelope in this way to produce this kind of sound, and likewise for the others. So now we can get choking to happen. Anyway, that's an aside. I'm not really using that functionality in this example, but it's good to know how to do that.
Just like so.
Now we'll talk about how I'm using CC control in battery to achieve some tonal variation on snare heads, as well as how to get the hi-hats opening and closing in the way I want. So first we'll talk about hi-hats. Even though this kit has good sounding hi-hat, has good sounding open and close sounds, they actually sound a little too acoustic. For instance, full open. So a good progression from open to close sounds, but I'm trying to go for a more aggressive electronic-ish kind of sound, so I find that actually goes against my goals. So what am I doing instead? Let's go to automation, MIDI. Notice how I have these CC number 4 entries. The way we add those, let's say for instance I want to add CC 30. So back in Logic, I'm going to choose CC 30 on some region here. And go to add new. And now notice it says use the controller you would like to add. I'm just going to move it. Notice how it showed up. I'm going to delete it because I don't need that. But now you see how to add CC number 4. Okay, what am I doing with CC 4? Well, I did a ton of experimenting, as is typically the case in sound design kind of madness. So that I could take this one sample and make it sound like everything between some kind of closed sort of sound to a full open. Once you have those CC numbers in battery, then you just drag this line, the one that says CC number, onto whatever knob you want to control. So let's say I wanted to control volume. I'll just drag it over, and then it would show up. That's intensity, but I don't want that. So now what I have here is the volume envelope, the pitch envelope, as well as for effects. I have this lo-fi. If I go back to the volume envelope, one thing I want to do is adjust the sustain, as well as some of these other parameters, so that in general I can get the kind of volume curves I'm looking for, such that when it's fully closed, I end up with this kind of sound. And then when it's fully open, it's this kind of sound. So if I move this, notice how the volume envelope is changing. I'm also using an effect, this lo-fi. So same thing, notice how when I move this, see some change. You notice how usually I have this triangle on the bottom, but for some of them it's the other way around. When the upper triangle is to the left, then you're doing inverse kind of style control. So if we look at that hold on the volume envelope, look what happens when I go from 0 all the way up. Hold is going to the left. The other ones are going to the right. Likewise on that effect, notice the hertz. As I go up, the hertz goes up. So I did a lot of experimenting. You would have to do similar, figure out which range of some parameter you want to use, and then whether you want to use it regularly or inverted control.
Is this your idea of fun, Matt?
What that allows us to do is say we have some hi-hat part, just so you see what's actually going on in Logic with the hi-hats. Let's say we convert this to MIDI, and then I'm just going to choose all these hi-hat parts. Notice these articulation IDs. This is what Logic is using to control the opening and closing. And then after some insanity, those actually get translated to the IDs 1 through 7 that DKD then use. So that's what I hear. Just to show you what's going on, I've assigned these articulation IDs 1 through 7. So if I play this back, you see that action going on here. The script is translating those IDs, sending CC data, and that's why we're hearing that opening and closing in battery. And by the way, that would also work if you didn't have any AIDs and you were modifying Logic hi-hat parts, adding CC data yourself. It would still work. So that's the beauty of the script, is it's pretty damn flexible. That's what I'm doing with CC number 4, using one sample and doing all sorts of parameter automation to get the opening and closing kind of vibe. Now with snare hits, I've decided to use the Snare Gothik 3 and 4. So with snare 3, I've added CC16, similar to how I showed you a moment ago. Just added that, and then you drag that CC number 16 onto the parameters that you want to control. So let's say I wanted to use control, I don't know, 42. Add new, and now move it around, and then it shows up. So with the snare I'm using pitch envelope, I could drag the CC number 42 onto a mount. I'll get rid of that because I'm using CC16. So that's what you do. You just drag this CC number 16 to whatever knob you want to control. So here we have intensity A5. That means A5 on the grid. Intensity is this amount of the pitch envelope. So let me go back to 16, CC16. And you see that amount changing here. And then also using this S rate. That's for the effect, the lo-fi hertz. So likewise, you see that moving a bit. And then also doing something similar with snare 4, using a different approach. So with snare 4, I decided to use a filter. Here's it without, like a fairly typical acoustic snare. I wanted to mangle that a bit. So I'm using the filter. And now the same CC value, number 16, adjust some of these parameters of this effect filter, the formant filter. So now I get a lot of variation. And so now just to play back so you get an idea for the kind of variation that we'll get from this snare 3 and 4. Here's 3, here's 4. So now that we've done some of our sound design kind of madness, we can go back to Logic, and I'm gonna open up Scripter. Now back at Logic, I have this MIDI Scripter plugin here loaded. And so I've already loaded up a file called Logic Drums to B4 Electronic. And I'm gonna hit Open Script in Editor. And this video isn't about my Logic Drums to Anything script. You can basically think of it as a universal drum mapping language that allows you to map any imaginable source drum library to any other target. So most of my example scripts are going from Logic drums to something, and I wrote the script mainly so I can go from any Logic acoustic drummer part to any other third-party library, so Addictive Drums, Superior Drum 3, or whatever. But because of the universality of this system, I can also map a Logic acoustic kit to any imaginable electronic kit.
Are you serious?
Are you serious?
And so this variable here, CC ranges source, this talks about how the source library handles CC data. So Logic here is the source, and this is how Logic handles opening and closing of its hi-hats. It took me a long time to reverse engineer Logic and hi-hats. It was a pretty crazy trip, not something I want to repeat. But the bottom line is I figured it all out, and this is what allows us to get hi-hats working in any third-party library. So Logic uses 7 levels. It uses these articulation IDs, 1 through 7. Sometimes you'll see IDs in the 10s, 20s, and 30s, but in the end, those get translated internally in Logic to IDs 1 through 7. And those IDs are equivalent to CC values, so fully closed corresponds to these kind of CC values, fully open to these. This is CC number 4 in this case. You can change this, but I recommend just keeping it as a script expect, so number 4. So you generally never have to change anything here. And then CC ranges target. This talks about how the target library handles CC data. In this case, the target library is battery 4 in that particular kit, that hardcore Gothik. I added those CC4 controls for various knobs in battery 4. And here I'm specifying 7 levels so I can match up to Logic 7. And I've just arbitrarily chosen it this way with each being equally spaced. So 0 to 17, then 18 to 35, etc., then 108 to 127. This way we know for any open close level in Logic, we're going to have the corresponding kind of CC control in battery 4 that we need. And likewise with snare, remember I added the number 16. You can kind of think of this as snare position control, but instead of the typical center versus edge position, you can think of it as a fairly standard kind of sound going to a more processed kind of sound. This is what's giving me that ability to automatically get some variation to the tone, and I'll show you how the mapping takes advantage of that. And then here are the notes in the source library. In this case, that means Logic. It's variable L. These tend to not change for any given acoustic kit that you use in Drummer. It's still using these same notes. Ignore what I have here for Stephen Slate Drums 5. I just took that script, edited it, And then this variable UN, these are user-defined notes. So these are notes that the source library is not using for anything. This way you can add additional kind of articulations. So Logic doesn't have snare, flam, ruff, and roll, but you can add these user notes and then trigger those kind of sounds in the target library. And if the library doesn't have those kind of sounds, then we can use some MIDI trickery to produce them. Likewise, we can add cymbal sounds. So Logic doesn't have a ride choke, etc. And you can change some of this in the GUI itself. If you click on Show Advanced Stuff, and then use or cymbal notes. So if you don't want the ride choke to be C-1, you can change that. Just make sure you pick a note that isn't used. And you can manually add entries here, and then those would show up here. But you can just change those note names here and not have to edit the script. Now onto the variable T. These are the target articulation notes. So the target being battery 4. In this case, that hardcore Gothic kit with my added pieces. So the choke notes for the cymbals, percussion. And I haven't specified every single note in battery. There are some sounds I didn't like the sound of that I didn't plan on using, so I just ignored them. But for the remaining ones, they're all here. And because we're mapping from Logic acoustic kits to an electronic kit, we have to figure out some kind of correspondence so that when there's a Logic rim shot versus edge, we know what kind of sample in battery we're going to use for those. So to my ears, this is how they kind of matched up, and I'll talk about this in the mapping in a second. So these are just some notes myself, so I know what kind of sounds there are. This is kind of cool anvil kind of sound that we can make use of in a way. I'll show you how I fit that into the grand scheme of things. And then here are the hi-hat kind of sounds that I like. But because I'm using that method of using CC4 to control the sound of the hi-hats, I'm actually not using these other notes. This is the one the script will use, but I still like to add all the notes anyway, so that if I decide to map to other notes, the notes are here. And a bunch of tom sounds in this particular battery kit, and I just listen to them and figure out which ones correspond to low kind of tom sound versus high. Likewise with the rides, a bell-ish kind of sound, edge, tip. And the 3 cymbals and battery, one of them is kind of to the left, the other 2 are kind of to the right. And the percussion that I added, tambourine hit plus an up-down kind of sound, same thing with a shaker hit and then an up-down. So that's kind of like the main hit. And then like an up-down, and then a tambourine, that's like a main hit, and then like an up-down. Now we're going to look at the mapping to figure out exactly what we need to do to get things working how we want. So on the left, these are the Logic notes, the ones that we showed earlier as that L. So I've decided to map Logic kick 1 to this Gothic 5 kick, and then kick 2 to Gothic 3. So those are the ones I'm using in battery. I'm not using them all. Some of them I decided just weren't going to fit the kind of vibe I had in mind. So we're using 3 and 5. And then with the snare, I've decided that Logic snare stick, that'll map to Gothic 5. It's not very sticky sounding. And then the side stick, I've decided to map to Gothic 1. Doesn't sound anything like a side stick, but I think it sounds cool played back as a side stick in the overall drum part. A rim shot is going to be this Gothic 3 part.
5. The count's 16.
But we're using this AID assign parameter, setting it to a value 1 or 2, telling it CC number 16. And what this is going to do is going to have the script automatically assign 1 or 2 randomly. And by the way, if you wanted 1 to be 2 times more often than the other one, you could do :2, but we'll keep it this way. Or say you wanted 2 to be 3 times more likely to be played back. So that's one of the features of the script, using likelihood of occurrence weights. But we'll just keep it that way. And then the script looks up here and knows if the AID was assigned 1, then it's going to generate CC values between 0 and 64. If it's 2, it's going to be 64 to 127. And that way we're going to get some random variation of that snare tone. The rim shot, I've chosen this Gothic 2 rim shot. That's rim shot edge. The center, I've chosen Gothic 4. Similar to how we're varying the rim shot, we're doing the same thing with the center, CC number 16. But this time we're going to say center is AID 1, and then the edge is going to be the same target note, the Gothic 4, this time AID 2. So that way Logic center and edge snare hit, those are going to play back with some random variation, producing variation in tone using this same action. 1 being given randomly some CC value in this range, 2 the value in that range. And if you want to edit the MIDI in Logic, you can add things like a Snare, Flam, or Ruff. And those can trigger here in Battery using some MIDI trickery. Logic Drummer won't produce those kind of sounds, but you can do all sorts of MIDI editing after the fact to get the script to produce those sounds. And on to the hi-hat. I talked about how we're using CC control to produce an open to a closed sound. And I won't drive you insane talking about how this all works. You just have to kind of trust me on this, that the script handles the opening and closing, the mapping of those weird Logic articulation IDs, the 10s, 20s, and 30s, etc., etc. Whether it's a Logic tip, shank, or edge, those are all going to play back this Gothik 4 hit. And depending on the articulation ID that Logic is using to control the opening and closing, the right kind of CC data is going to get sent to Battery based on what's going on here between CC range of source and target and CC4. And by the way, if you didn't want to use that kind of action, you actually wanted to use the real open and close samples, and then I could just comment this out. In this case, we would use articulation switching. So if I hit run script, now go back to this example of the hi-hats. You start progressing. And that's a good sounding opening and closing progression, but I don't want to use that because I want it to sound a little more mangled. So go back into scripter and I'll get those comments back in place. And then hit run script again. Re-enable for Gothik 4, the volume envelope. I don't think I'm using pitch, but I'm going to enable that. And it's lo-fi. And then play it back. And now we're back to that mangled version. There's no foot close, foot splash kind of sounds in this Gothik kit, but I just chose a close and an open sound for the foot close and foot splash. Logic has 3 toms, even though it has 6 notes, but Logic seems to have the same thing play back on 2 of its low tom hits, 2 of its mids, 2 of its highs. So here, Logic's low toms playing back the lowest of the sounds in Gothik. The mids are playing back the more middle of the road kind of tones. And then Logic's high toms will play back as those highest tom hits in Gothik. So all these hits. A Logic ride edge will go to this Gothik 1. Logic's in outs will go to the ride Gothik 2, both of them. Logic's bell will go to Gothik 3. These are the kind of sounds we have here. And then onto the cymbals, a Logic cymbal left crash. It'll play back as Gothik 1. Remember I mentioned that's the one that was kind of in the left stereo field. And even though Logic doesn't have a choke note, we're using user-defined nodes. A Logic left choke that'll trigger this cymbal Gothik 1 choke that we defined earlier, which is accomplishing choking in the way we talked about. Likewise, Logic right crash, that's going to trigger the cymbal Gothik 2 or 3. Randomly, one will be chosen. And likewise with its choke note. Logic doesn't have a China crash, but we can use a user-defined note. Add that in the MIDI to your heart's content. And that's going to trigger that China Gothik in Battery. Onto the percussion. So the shaker, we can do something a little unique here. If there's no AID in Logic, nothing assigned to it, then it's just going to choose one of these 3 types of shaker hits, so that'll add a lot of variation. Now if you want to mark up the MIDI, add a 3 for a regular shaker hit, or a 4 for a shaker up, 5 for a down, or you can edit these numbers, make them whatever you want. So this gives you some control over how to make some things random, as well as how to decide yourself what kind of hit will be, where, when. Likewise with the tambourine, same kind of idea for the regular hit and the up down. And then a Logic hand clap will go to a clap that I loaded in Battery, and likewise the cowbell directly to that Battery cowbell that I loaded. And then these ones here, you probably won't have any need for this. This is in case you want to do automatic detection of pedal, chick, and splash sounds based on raw CC data. So here we're just specifying what the chick note should be, and then what the splash should be. And these are those notes that I chose earlier when we decided what to map to from Logic's foot close and foot splash.
Where's Joy?
What?
He said he was here.
So with that out of the way, I hit run script. There are no errors. If there was an error, we'd see it down here. We'd also see some information in the GUI. You'd have to fix things. For instance, if you made a typo here, say you spelled Gothik here with a C, run script, now you have an error. That's not how we spelled it earlier, so it's having a hard time looking it up. Let's change that back to OK. All is good. And I'm going to save. And Now what we can do is we're taking this Logic drummer part and it's going to play back through battery 4. First, let me just disable the bass part just so you can hear, for instance, what's going on with the hi-hats now. So you hear that translating of the opening and closing, that that's kind of cool. You also hear the snare varying its tone. Now let's play that back with the bass line. Now notice that anvil kind of sound. Remember earlier I talked about using that snare side stick in Logic, map that to that anvil-ish kind of sound. And so that was done just simply in Drummer, choosing this particular part that the snare is going to play back as the side stick. Now because of all that work we did in translating Logic drummer notes to this battery 4 kit, we can make any kind of changes we want and we don't have to touch anything in the script, we don't have to touch anything in battery, everything's just going to magically work exactly as needed. So in this case I was using even though here it's labeled psychedelic rock, I was using a funk rock setting. Let's say instead I want to play that back with a psychedelic kind of vibe. This has the same battery 4 kit and the same scripter. So now I'll hit play. You can always look at this console output in the scripter to see how things are mapping, to make sure things are mapping the way you would expect. So Logic snare center, going to that snare Gothik 4, etc. for any given articulation. That was in Logic, so Logic's tambourine, going to a tambourine in battery, and then a Logic HH tip, mapping to that Gothik 4, CC data being generated. So you see all that happening in the output.
I know what you're thinking. Because right now I'm thinking the same thing.
Now I know what you're thinking, so this is really great and cool. You showed us how to do all this with battery 4 in one particular kit, but what about a different kit? Well, yeah, so let me show you how to do that. I'm not going to go into the details, but I've also done this with another kit. This one is Dragon Kit, and so again I made my own version of it, where I added some percussion as well as the cymbal choking like I showed you earlier with that other battery 4 kit, and again with some use of MIDI CC controllers to do all sorts of sound design craziness. Same concept. This particular kit is really cool because it has these open sounds that all sound unique. And so we can actually think of these as being like edge, shank, and bell kind of hi-hat sounds. And so I can play this one back, but first let me go into scripter to show you how easy that was to adapt it. Didn't change anything here, nothing there, just added the articulations in that Dragon Kit here. Made my notes on what sounds like what, which helps me do the mapping later. And then the mapping, just like before, the same concept. Same thing we did with the snares and using tonal variation. I've duplicated that here. Only difference with the hi-hats is that now the tip, shank, and edge are going to separate articulations, since this kit has a little more hi-hat variation. And once again, you have the ability to use AID switches as well if you don't want to use that CC4 control and instead just do articulation switching. And no surprises with toms, rides, cymbals, percussion. So now I can play this one back. Now you might be thinking, okay, that's all cool. You showed us how you did this in battery 4, but what about a totally different drum machine, drum synth?
Let's check.
Well, once again, I anticipated you asking about that, and so I've also done this with Ultrabeats. So now, let's go to this track. I'm gonna open up Ultrabeat, and I chose this Big Beat remix kit. In a similar concept, I did some sound design, manipulation, but whereas in Battery 4 it's really easy to add CC control, in Ultrabeat it's kind of puzzling, very enigmatic. How it handles that internally. Some knobs, you have to look for where it says via and then choose one of these controls. It's really pretty obtuse. So what you can do is use Logic modifiers and make sure the scripter is always the first one, modifiers come next. And with each modifier, I just set some CC value to control something. So 16 with snare. For some hits, it's controlling cutoff of the noise filter with a level of one of these band filters. For hi-hat open control, it's varying pitch, which is a good way to take one sample and make it sound like it's going from open to closed. And also I varied the shaker, similar concept, just varying some parameter. And with the shaker I decided to use CC number 20. It's a little more complicated, but not too much. You just add a modifier for each parameter you want to change. If you want to have a couple parameters change with one CC, well, you just have several of these modifiers using some CC. So here at number 16, controlling several parameters across several different snare hits, etc. with CC4, and then 20. And again, the script editing for this one was pretty straightforward. So on the top here, one thing did change. I added this entry for CC20. This is the one that I have set up with modifier instance to do some tonal adjustment on the shaker hits. And then nothing changes here. And then the target articulations, I just added the hits in Ultrabeats that I plan on using in the mapping, along with my comments on how I plan on using those. And then the same thing we saw before, nothing different going on in terms of the thought process. The hi-hats, any Logic type of hit is going to the same open hit in Ultrabeats, which is the one being manipulated to produce that open to close kind of sound. And like in the other example, you also have these AID switches, so if you don't want to use that kind of open and closing, you want to use the actual individual articulations in Ultrabeats, well, you can do it that way, just uncomment out all these AID switches. And then likewise with the tom hits, rides, cymbals, and now with the percussion, there's only a shaker and a maracas sound in Ultrabeats, so the shake onto the shaker. I had Logic's tambourine go with maracas and Ultrabeats. And then for hand claps and cabal, I just chose some hits that I thought would be good replacements. So that's all there was to it. So now I can play this kick back.
Trying to tell me that I can dodge bullets?
So the bottom line of all this is you can create this kind of scripts for your favorite electronic kits. Doesn't matter what the kit is from, if it's Battery 4, Ultrabeats, or whatever. And that gives you a super powerful tool for your electronic music drums production, because you can use these Logic acoustic drummer kits with their hi-hat grooves and all the other realism that they're applying to things like tom fill, snares, everything, and then get those transformed to these electronic kits in their unique sonic spaces. That concludes the video. So what did we do? We looked at using Logic Drummer the way you'd normally use it for doing acoustic drum parts, making the kind of changes you want in its settings so that it follows the structure of your music, playing a hi-hat groove when you want a hi-hat groove, playing a ride groove when you want a ride, etc., etc. All the usual kind of stuff to get the most out of drummer as an acoustic drummer, and then mapping that over to some electronic kit, in my case Battery 4, where I showed you how to use MIDI automation with CC controllers like 4 for a hi-hat, 16 for snare. Doing some sound design on this hi-hat sound, as well as on some of the snare hits. Went over the basics of what we do in Scripter, and I know it might seem confusing at first. You can think of this as a universal drum mapping language, probably the most advanced drum mapping system in existence right now. So with that comes the expense of it being a little tricky at first. There's a learning curve, but once you get this language, you you can use these same principles for any kind of mapping situation. So you saw how I did it in Battery 4. You could do this with any imaginable electronic kit. You just have to figure out which pieces of the kit are going to map to from certain logic hits, and then just figure out the mapping details. And with all this craziness going on with AI-produced music, hopefully you might find this a little more organic, hands-on. You might find it kind of fun, and you might be surprised at the results you get just from taking an acoustic kit and playing it back through an electronic kit. So it's all about reinvigorating the excitement of music production.
I could have used a little more cowbell.
And if something isn't clear, just write in the comments or get in touch with me otherwise. I'm going to be able to help walk people through this kind of stuff. So with that, till next time.